Nora, do you think it's possible to include everyone?
Yep. Yeah, well, let me ask Alicia. Alicia, can we go ahead and mute people and then?
Yes, so I'm going to mute everyone, and then please, we are going to keep you on mute for most of the presentation. So please, you'll have the ability to take yourself off mute, but I'm going to put everyone on mute for now.
Alicia? Okay, I would like to know if you hear me. Can someone confirm if you're listening?
Yes, we can hear you. You sound great.
Okay, so you want me to start, right?
Yes, please.
Okay. Bueno, I'm going to give the introduction in Spanish since I see that the most of the crowd is from Puerto Rico. Anyway, we will have the translations for the presentation, which is the most important part. So, saludo, mi nombre es Wilfrido, ¿verdad? Wilfrido Ortiz, Senior CPD Rep de aquí de la Oficina del Caribe. A nombre de la directora de la oficina, Olga de la Rosa, les doy la bienvenida y gracias por estar aquí en esta presentación. La razón principal por la cual hemos convocado este entrenamiento es porque a finales del mes de septiembre salió el CPD Notice 20-08, el cual comprende la reglamentación del programa de ESG-CV. Importante, este notice ofrece flexibilidades adicionales, como por ejemplo la de eximir de pareo a los fondos regulares de ESG si se usan para COVID. O sea, fondos de ESG que se usen para COVID se le eximiría de pareo, lo cual representa una oportunidad única e histórica en beneficio de nuestra población. Esto nunca se había visto. Sin embargo, pues hasta ahora hemos visto un movimiento un poco lento por parte de los grantees en trabajar las enmiendas adicionales que tendrían que someter para sacarle provecho a estas flexibilidades, que como dije otra vez, o sea, es histórico y hay que aprovecharlo. Así que en adición a eso, también ya a diciembre del 2020, que llevamos tiempo con la pandemia, vemos que con los fondos, pues observamos un desembolso que también está un poco lento y en algunos casos, pues ningún desembolso de ESG por parte de los grantees. Así que esto ya apunta a que va a ser uno de los primeros problemas a señalarse. Por otro lado, cuando vemos las noticias, pues vemos que en Estados Unidos se está hablando de millones de personas que pueden terminar sin hogar debido a las deudas de renta y utilidades, y por eso esta ayuda hace tanta falta. El training va a ser en español y en inglés, y le damos muchísimas gracias a Marlisa Grogan, que es la que va a presentar. Marlisa es Desk Officer de la oficina de SNAPS, que es de Homeless en Washington. Una persona muy brillante y muy conocedora, y le tenemos, ¿verdad?, mucho agradecimiento por hacer esta sesión especialmente para Puerto Rico e Islas Vírgenes. Matt Wexler, TA Provider, y a Darlene Matthews también muchas gracias. Matt va a estar dando la traducción y al español, y pueden postear las preguntas en el chat. Y entonces el equipo de trabajo va a estar contestándola para el final. So for the people in the USVI, if they are connected already, you will have the opportunity. A group of persons that will be answering those questions at the end of the training. So thank you very much, and I leave you with Marlisa and Matt. Thank you. So you got it.
Before we go to Marlisa, maybe Alicia, who's helping us with some of the behind the scenes tech items, can talk us through some of those housekeeping things, just so we have all the tech stuff covered.
Okay, thank you everyone
Thank
for
you.
joining today's webinar. To join the webinar via the phone, please dial the number you see here, +1 939 945 0244. If you have any problems connecting with audio, or if you have any tech issues during the course of this webinar, please feel free to reach out to me directly in the chat. My name is Alicia Lemer. You'll be able to send me a chat directly. A recording of today's session, along with the slide deck and a copy of the chat and Q&A content, will be posted to the HUD Exchange within 2 to 3 business days. For event information for upcoming office hours, along with copies of all materials, you can find them at the link that's included in this PowerPoint. I also will share, I already shared a link to Spanish translations of today's presentation and documents referenced in this presentation. I'll be sure to share them again in the chat once we get started and we get into the content to make sure that everyone has those resources. And in order to ask a question, please select the chat icon to make a comment or to ask a question of our presenters. Our presenters will be able to answer those questions at their earliest convenience. Be certain that the to field is set to everyone. And we please ask that you keep yourselves on mute during the bulk of this presentation so that our presenters are able to keep the presentation rolling. With that, I will hand it back to you, Nora.
Fantastic, thank you. And I am going to kick it off. Again, thanks for having us here. We're excited to be with you all to present information about the ESG-CV notice. And the first person we're going to hear from today is Marlisa Grogan from HUD's Office of Special Needs Assistance Programs. Marlisa, if you're talking, you're on mute. We can't hear you.
Can you hear me okay now?
Yeah, there you are.
Okay, great. All right. So good morning, everyone. It's great to be here with you today. I think Wilfredo went through everyone who's going to be joining us today. We also have our resource advisors who are available to help answer your questions once we get to them at the end of the presentation. So without further ado, I want to just briefly go over the goals that we have for this session. We, your HUD field office graciously asked us to come and present this material to you, the ESG-CV recipients and subrecipients in Puerto Rico. What we did was we took the basic ESG-CV notice requirements that we covered in the September 3rd webinar, and we honed in on the issues that are particularly relevant to you all in Puerto Rico. So what we would like to do is provide you more detailed guidance on the waivers, the alternative requirements, and the materials in the ESG-CV notice, and give you enough time for questions and answers at the end.
Ok, soy Matthew Wexler. Yo voy a servir como traductor de esta presentación. Saludos a todos, bienvenidos todos y todas. El propósito de hoy de este taller, que fue organizado por la oficina de HUD, específicamente para revisar cuáles son las renuncias, es decir, los waivers y los requisitos del programa de ESG-CV. Básicamente, ese taller está basado en otro que fue dado el septiembre 3, 2020, dando en cuenta los detalles que son relevantes para Puerto Rico. Pues la meta es revisar esos renuncias y requisitos y dar tiempo al final para preguntas y contestaciones. Gracias. Thank you.
And the key areas that we all are also going to highlight is get to more specifics about how preventing, preparing for, and responding to coronavirus is defined in the ESG-CV notice, the progressive expenditure deadlines and recapture requirements, the additional eligible activities that were established in the ESG-CV notice, the match requirements, going over those in more detail, as well as the reporting requirements. And throughout, you will see us highlight the importance of non-congregate shelter, which is so important to minimize the spread of the disease.
Pues esas son las áreas claves, clarificando qué quiere decir cuando decimos prevenir, preparar y contestar a los escenarios de COVID, los requisitos, revisar las fechas límites para gastos y cuáles son las provisiones de recapturar fondos, hablar de las actividades adicionales que son elegibles, los requisitos de pareo y los requisitos de los informes, dando mucha atención a la situación de los albergues no congregados. Eso es decir, non-congregate shelter, que va a ser un enfoque de esta presentación. Thank you.
And you're going to hear us use a number of different terms that we want to make sure you're understanding what we're referring to. The ESG, we're referring to the Emergency Solutions Grants Program. ESG-CV is the specific emergency solutions grant that's under the CARES Act. The recipients, when we refer to recipients, we're talking about the unit of local government who directly receives the ESG-CV grant. Under the ESG program, that's cities, counties, states, and territories. And in the ESG regs, Puerto Rico is defined as a state for purposes of the ESG regulations. Subrecipient, when we refer to subrecipient, we mean the entity who receives funding from the recipient. So if Puerto Rico sub-awards funds to a provider, they are the subrecipient. And they're generally the provider, but they may pass through their funding to a sub-subrecipient, which is an entity who receives the funding from a subrecipient and does the direct services or housing.
Pues aquí son unos términos importantes en las definiciones. Yo pienso que son bien definidos aquí en inglés. Lo más importante es entender que ESG-CV es diferente que el programa de ESG, y ese es básicamente el enfoque de hoy, pero también reconocer los participantes del taller en dónde caen ustedes en tener que ser recipiente, subrecipiente y subrecipiente. Es bien importante reconocer dónde, cuál es el papel de ustedes en ese proceso. Thank you.
Now I'm going to turn it over to Nora, and she is going to kick us off with the definitions of prevent, prepare, and respond to coronavirus. Nora?
Yes, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Great. Okay, like Marlisa said, we're going to begin with some information and examples about the CARES Act requirement related to prevent, prepare, and respond to coronavirus. If you could go to the next slide, Marlisa. Understanding the terms prevent, prepare, and respond requires digging into these definitions to really understand what they are telling us. We'll start with the phrase prevent coronavirus, and these are activities that are meant to prevent the initial or future spread of the virus among people experiencing homelessness, people at risk of homelessness, recipient or subrecipient staff, or other shelter or housing residents. Prepare for coronavirus means that these activities are carried out prior to or during a coronavirus outbreak, and they focus on the planning elements of keeping people healthy and reducing the risk of exposure to coronavirus and avoiding or slowing the spread of the disease. And activities that respond to coronavirus are those carried out once coronavirus has spread to people experiencing homelessness, provider staff, or once individuals and families lose or are at risk of losing their housing as a result of the economic downturn caused by coronavirus.
Ok, aquí son las definiciones importantes de los tres aspectos del programa. Prevenir, prevent, preparar, prepare y contestar, respond. Bien importante diferenciarlos todos. En el primero, prevención, la idea es prevenir la propagación del virus. Eso es decir, que cuáles son las actividades dirigidas a parar, ¿verdad? A parar el virus antes que llegue. Preparación, son actividades de planificación, ¿verdad? Planificación para prevenir el virus o para reducir el riesgo del virus para personas frágiles. El tercero es contestar, son actividades hechas, ¿verdad? Actividades hechas ya una vez que el virus ha propagado a esa población de desambulantes, a profesionales o a individuos y familias que han perdido o están a riesgo de perder su vivienda como resultado de la economía. Thank you.
And then on the next slide on this chart, we'll walk through this a bit today. We know it has a lot of information on it. It will also be available for your future review and reference. What this chart does is it again provides the definition or explanation of what the terms prevent, prepare, and respond mean. And then it gives some examples to further explain the ways that ESG-CV funded projects might show that they are preventing, preparing, or responding to coronavirus. So I'll talk through some of the examples right now. Some ways that you might show that a program is preventing, might meet the preventing standard for the ESG funds would be providing personal protective equipment to staff or program participants. This could also be paying for non-congregate shelter options, such as hotels and motels. It could also be paying for hand washing stations, portable toilets for use by people living in unsheltered situations. And it might also be providing rapid rehousing or homelessness prevention assistance to individuals and families who are homeless or at risk of homelessness to reduce their risk of contracting or further spreading the virus. Matt, do you want to just translate that bit, or maybe go through these one at a time instead of trying to do the whole thing all at once?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Antes de empezar a traducir, déjeme decir que para mí este dispositivo es el más importante en toda la presentación porque da unos ejemplos bien concretos de cómo puedes usar los fondos dentro del programa de ESG-CV. Pues para empezar, de prevenir, los ejemplos son dar equipo protectivo personal a las personas que están participando en el programa y los profesionales. Pagar para opciones como hoteles y moteles que pueden servir como albergues. Pagar para estaciones de lavamanos y inodoros portables para las personas que están viviendo en la calle o en una situación donde no tiene refugio. Dar, por ejemplo, rapid rehousing y prevención, asistencia de prevención a individuos y familias que son desambulantes o a riesgo de perder su casa. Thank you.
And then some examples of preparing for coronavirus would include updating written standards to prioritize people at severe risk of contracting coronavirus for shelter and housing assistance that are, of course, consistent with fair housing and non-discrimination policies. Could also be adapting coordinated entry policies and procedures to account for social distancing measures or increased demand. Could also mean ways that you use to develop a strategy for landlord recruitment and to provide housing to people experiencing homelessness or at risk of homelessness. It also includes training homeless providers on infectious disease prevention and mitigation. And it also could include implementing a non-congregate shelter strategy to reduce the spread of coronavirus.
Ok, dentro del área de preparación, eso básicamente, again, son planificación. Primero es revisar las normas para dar prioridad a las personas que están a riesgo de contratar el virus. El número 2 aquí es adaptar las políticas de Coordinated Entry y procedimientos para contar de la necesidad de mantener distancias sociales. Tercero es desarrollar una estrategia para reclutar a dueños de vivienda para que ellos puedan dar vivienda, espacio, habitaciones a las personas que son desambulantes o riesgo de perder su casa. Cuarto es training, capacitación para los proveedores en términos de prevención de maldades y mitigación del virus. Y el último es implementar una estrategia de albergue non-congregate para reducir la propagación del virus. Thank you.
And then finally, some examples of responding to coronavirus for ESG-CV could include transporting individuals and families to medical appointments, paying for shelter to isolate individuals who have contracted coronavirus, providing rental assistance to those who are at risk of losing their housing or who have become homeless, and also providing hazard pay to recipient or subrecipient staff who put their own health at risk to continue to provide the necessary services to individuals and families experiencing or at risk of homelessness.
Ok, esa es la tercera categoría, responder, contestar. Para empezar, se puede, como ejemplo, dar transportación a personas que tienen citas médicas, que son desambulantes, pagar para los albergues que se pueden hospedar a personas que tienen el virus y que se quedan separados de otra persona. Tercero es dar asistencia de alquiler a las personas que están a riesgo de perder su vivienda o que son ya desambulantes. Y el último es pagar a los profesionales, eso es decir, personal del staff, de recipiente, subrecipiente, un hazard pay, que significa básicamente un bono porque ellos están poniendo en riesgo su propia salud. Thank you.
And on the next slide, we see even more information about preventing, preparing, or responding to coronavirus. The previous slide had examples. I have a little bit more explanation here just to clarify really what this standard means and how you have to meet it. So one item we want to clarify is that activities do not need to accomplish all three aspects of this, just one. So they don't need to prevent, prepare, and respond to coronavirus. They just need to meet one of those elements. And you can also, in meeting the standard, consider both public health needs as well as addressing the economic impact caused by coronavirus. And it's also important to know that the tie, the connection to preventing, preparing, or responding is at the project activity level, not at the household level, which we'll discuss a little bit more in the next few slides.
Ok, eso para clarificación, eso es decir que las actividades no son necesariamente para las tres categorías de actividad, de preparar, planificar y contestar, solamente uno. Pues, pero sí tiene que tomarse en cuenta las necesidades de la salud pública y también el impacto económico causado por el virus. El tercero dice que la conexión de cómo usar los fondos de esas actividades es a nivel de actividad y no a nivel de la casa o individuo. Y ese punto se va a discutir en los dispositivos siguientes. Thank you.
HUD expects that ESG-CV recipients will verify that activities are meeting the requirements to prevent, prepare, or respond to coronavirus through HUD's Integrated Disbursement Information System, which is also known as IDIS. When ESG-CV recipients set up activities in IDIS, and the activities are the total amounts used for the eligible components of emergency shelter, street outreach, rapid rehousing, homelessness prevention and administration. The description that they enter functions as the administrative record that the funds for each activity either prevent, prepare for, or respond to coronavirus. In the example on the slide, we see a screenshot of a sample IDIS activity screen that details how the recipient is using annual ESG for COVID response. We see here on the second part of the example, the text says that this is annual ESG for COVID response. $24,000 from the 2019 emergency shelter activity has been reprogrammed for coronavirus response. These funds will be used to prevent, prepare for, and respond to coronavirus by enhancing shelter sanitation per local public health infection control guidelines. Funds will also be used for personal protective equipment and hygiene supplies. So this is a sample of how prepare for or respond to is documented through IDIS. The recipient must also maintain documentation in their administrative records demonstrating when they began planning for coronavirus. We have additional information about this requirement on the next slide.
Ok, aquí estamos dando un ejemplo de la documentación dentro de IDIS de una actividad. Pues en ese ejemplo se ve en la parte de arriba donde dice Annual ESG Non-COVID Response, ¿verdad? Eso es el ESG regular, 500,000 para Emergency Shelter Activity. Y debajo de eso, en la segunda parte, es el COVID Response. Y aquí básicamente es donde uno se va a describir la actividad y cómo esos van a prevenir, preparar o contestar a la situación del virus. Y aquí da un ejemplo de Enhancing Shelter Sanitation, sanitación de los albergues, para prevenir infecciones más. Y también dice la última oración, funds will be used for personal protective equipment, que los fondos se van a usar para equipo personal de protección y higiene. Debajo del ejemplo dice que hay que mantener la documentación también en los archivos, específicamente, bien importante, cuando el gobierno del Estado de Puerto Rico, o el Commonwealth de Puerto Rico o al nivel del municipio, empezó a preparar por el virus. Thank you.
So now that we've covered preventing, preparing, or respond to, we want to move on to what are some important dates related to the ESG-CV funds. We see that one of the important dates, which was just mentioned, is documenting the initial date of coronavirus preparation. Every ESG-CV recipient has to have a record of when their local response to coronavirus began. And this date must be on or after January 21st, 2020, which is the date that HUD set as the initial response date.
Ok, esas son de las fechas importantes. Primero es la fecha de elegibilidad de gastos. Y fíjense que eso es antes de cualquier asignación de fondos. Pues esa fecha puede empezar enero 21 de 2020. Pero tiene que tener la documentación de cómo empezó de preparar el gobierno para el coronavirus. Tiene que tener, por ejemplo, minutos de unas reuniones, de una llamada, un screenshot de la pantalla de la computadora de la invitación en el calendario. Esos son documentos indicando dónde empezó a preparar para el coronavirus y esos gastos pueden ser reembolsables. Thank you.
ESG-CV funds, similar to annual ESG, have deadlines for the obligation and expenditure of funds. However, HUD does allow some flexibility for the usual 60-day ESG obligation requirement in two situations. The first is if a state recipient intends to carry out the activities itself. If that's the case, they have 180 days to obligate funds. The second has to do with the process a state will use to obligate funds. When a state wants to identify entities that have capacity and expertise to mitigate the impacts of coronavirus, including those who haven't previously or recently received ESG funding, important dates to know about for the ESG program relate to, sorry, that didn't make any sense. Let me try that again. My notes got all confused there. When a state wants to identify entities that have capacity and expertise to mitigate the impacts of coronavirus, they have more time to obligate funds. So instead of the usual 60 days to obligate funds, they have up to 240 days to obligate those funds. They have to maintain program records that describe the changes they made that are going to be used to identify and select new recipients and why the extension is necessary. And the start date for when the timeline begins is the date that the grant agreement for the first allocation of ESG funds was signed. Matt, you want to try that one? I'm sorry, I butchered that a little bit.
No, that's okay. Pues estamos hablando primero de la obligación que tiene. Usualmente son 60 días después de tener un grant agreement, pero en este caso hay una flexibilidad. Pues si es tratando a Puerto Rico como fue un estado, tiene 180 días para obligar los fondos si esas actividades son llevar a cabo directamente por el gobierno de Puerto Rico, o tiene hasta 240 días para agregar los fondos de ESG-CV a los subrecipientes. ¿Y por qué? Porque cuando necesita más tiempo para planificar, identificar y seleccionar nuevos subrecipientes, pero tienes que documentar ese proceso. Pues Program Records must describe, eso es decir, describir los cambios que tienen los planes y por qué necesita la extensión. Okay.
On the expenditure side, all ESG-CV funds must be expended by September 30th, 2022. This means that costs must be incurred before the last day of September 2022. Also note that if the ESG-CV limitations apply, emergency shelter and temporary emergency shelter have expenditure deadlines that are earlier than September 30th, 2022, which we will discuss in more detail later in the presentation.
Okay, aquí son fechas de gastos, de expenditure deadlines, y dice el primer punto que la última fecha, el último día es septiembre 30 de 2022. Para tener todo ya gastado de los fondos elegibles. También los otros dos puntos son básicamente marcas de progreso. El segundo dice que tiene que tener ya gastado 20% de la asignación antes de septiembre 30, 2021, y de ahí el último 80% de los gastos antes de marzo 31 de 2022. También hay otras fechas que son aplicables para los albergues y refugios de emergencia que se van a hablar enseguida. Thank you.
And based on the expenditure targets explained in the previous slide, HUD may recapture ESG-CV funds in certain circumstances. HUD may recapture up to 20% of a recipient's total award, which means both the first and second allocation of ESG, if the recipient has not expended at least 20% of those awards by September 30th, 2021. And HUD may recapture up to 80% of a recipient's total award if the recipient has not expended at least 80% of that award by March 31st, 2022. Prior to recapturing funds as described here, HUD will follow the enforcement process in the ESG regulation and provide the recipient with an opportunity to provide a spending plan demonstrating that all of the recipient's ESG-CV funds will be expended by September 30th, 2022.
Pues aquí son provisiones de recapturar los fondos, que HUD puede venir para recapturar fondos si no llega a ciertas metas. El primero es que tiene que gastar 20% de la asignación antes de septiembre 30, 2021. El segundo es, tiene que gastar 80% antes de marzo 31 de 2022. Y si uno no llega a esas metas, puede ser que HUD dale una noticia, un aviso, que se van a venir para recapturar, pero también le van a dar la oportunidad de entregar un plan de gastos demostrando que se puede gastar todos los fondos antes de la última fecha, septiembre 30, 2022.
And now I'm going to turn it back to Marlisa.
Hi, everybody. Before we get into more of the specifics of ESG-CV grant requirements, we want to take a little time to discuss infection control measures and winter shelter planning, especially now with the rates of infection increasing. And we are also going to go over how ESG-CV funds can be used for these efforts. So one of the first considerations, based on what we've learned so far about the important aspects of successful winter planning, is the ideas that you see in front of you. We know that it's really important to coordinate with public health partners to plan for winter. That partnership is essential. Purchase for PPE for staff and clients, that is another important aspect of winter planning and reducing the spread of infection. Keeping shelters at decompressed levels is going to be important in the colder months, as it always is, but especially so in the winter. And setting up non-congregate shelter is going to be really important to prevent outbreaks in the homeless population.
Ok, aquí están varios puntos para planificar para los meses que vienen como invierno, un tiempo no tanto de frío en todo Puerto Rico, pero sí en unas partes, especialmente en el centro, en la montaña. Primer punto es, hay que coordinar con el sector de salud pública para planificación. Segundo es adquisición de equipo de protección personal para el staff y también para clientes. Tercero es mantener en los albergues a unos niveles más bajos, es decir, menos gente durante este periodo. Y el cuarto es preparar y organizar albergues no congregados, non-congregate shelter, para prevenir la contagiación en la población de desambulantes. Thank you.
Another key feature of winter planning is using non-congregate shelter. And when we provide technical assistance to communities that are experiencing outbreaks within their homeless population, or they want to reduce the risk of infection, we strongly recommend non-congregate sheltering, and Puerto Rico should strongly consider non-congregate sheltering options in your response to COVID-19. Non-congregate shelter can take many different forms, including hotels, dormitories, using other structures used for other purposes and converting them into non-congregate sheltering space. COCs should ensure that people who are homeless, who are at higher risk, such as those who are elderly or with medical vulnerabilities, are included in non-congregate sheltering approaches. So in order to do this, work with your local public health department to prioritize people experiencing homelessness for non-congregate shelter, And one important reminder is that non-congregate shelter is an eligible ESG-CV activity under the shelter component.
Sí, el enfoque aquí es dar énfasis a la oportunidad de usar fondos para albergues no congregados. Eso puede ser de diferentes lugares como un hotel, dormitorio de una escuela, puede ser espacio que tiene iglesia como de retiros espirituales. Son varios sitios en donde se puede adaptar y usar esos espacios para proveer refugio. Los CHC deben asegurar que para la población de desambulantes que son frágiles de una forma, que ellos están específicamente incluidos en este enfoque. Cuarto es trabajar con el Departamento de la Salud Pública para dar prioridad a las personas que son sin hogar para ese propósito de non-congregate shelter. Y el último es simplemente para recordarse que este es un enfoque elegible de los fondos de ESG-CV. Thank you.
We're going to go into more detail now about the additional eligible ESG activities under the CARES Act. So many, or actually all of the eligible activities under the regular ESG program can be funded with ESG-CV. The additional activities that can also be paid for with ESG-CV, as well as annual ESG-CV that's for COVID response, include temporary emergency shelter, landlord incentives, volunteer incentives, hand washing stations and portable bathrooms, training, which is more expansive than it typically is under the ESG program, and hazard pay, which is also eligible ordinarily, but we just provide more specifics in the notice.
Estas son actividades elegibles adicionales, empezando con albergues de corto plazo o temporero, incentivos para dueños de vivienda, incentivos para voluntarios. Abajo dice estaciones de lavar las manos y inodoros portables, capacitación, training, capacitación y hazard pay, que significa compensación adicional por el riesgo. Nota bien que de incentivos de voluntarios, de estaciones de lavar manos, de capacitación y de compensación adicional tiene una estrella, es decir, que esos no son cubiertos aquí en este webinar, pero puedes buscar el webinar de septiembre 3 para adicionales.
So for temporary emergency shelter, we define it in the notice as a structure or a portion of a structure that's used for a limited time because of a crisis, such as a natural disaster or public health emergency. And the reason is to provide shelter to individuals and families displaced from their normal place or residence, or shelter or shelter or unsheltered locations. So we have here just sort of a checklist that helps you to determine whether an activity would fall under temporary emergency shelter or not. And as the definition indicates, it's used to respond to a natural disaster. The documentation requirements are that a local public health official determines that temporary emergency shelter is necessary for the community's coronavirus response, and it's in use only for the period of time needed for coronavirus response. And that time limit is January 31st, 2022, if the limitations of the notice apply. Otherwise, it would be September 30th, 2022, when all funds need to be expended. In general, a temporary emergency shelter has to meet these very basic criteria, including protection from inclement weather, which includes cover on all sides and overhead. Temporary emergency shelter needs to provide a space for program participants to sleep and rest, and that specifically includes sleeping accommodations like a mat, a cot, a bed, for structures that provide overnight shelter. And the third thing is that it needs to provide access to sanitary facilities for hygiene and toileting.
Ok, aquí son unas diferencias entre un albergue o refugio permanente y uno temporario. Eso es decir que cuando no se puede tener los requisitos para un albergue permanente, se puede usar en una estructura, un espacio para un refugio temporero. Pero hay ciertos requisitos. Uno, que eso es solamente durante el periodo de COVID, que tiene que tener una declaración de un oficial de salud pública para declarar que este refugio temporario es necesario para responder a la situación del virus. Y también, bien importante, tiene un tiempo limitado, ¿verdad? Un refugio de emergencia de corto plazo se puede usar hasta enero 31 de 2022 si no tiene una excepción de HUD, un waiver, una renuncia. Generalmente, estos refugios tienen que dar protección del tiempo del clima, dar espacio para descansar y dormir, incluyendo una cama o algo en donde se puede descansar, y también tener acceso a usar el baño.
We have a guidance document that sort of gives an overview of the alternate approaches to winter sheltering, and it goes into detail about the facilities or the spaces that you could consider for non-congregate sheltering or just providing alternate shelter options. And I see one question that's in the chat about ways that you can provide or different examples of non-congregate sheltering. This material provides a good, better, best approach, including a range of the types of spaces that you could repurpose. You could repurpose public spaces like rec centers, all the way to a best practice approach, which would be hotels and motels used for non-congregate shelter, where you're providing individual rooms for people to isolate or quarantine. This material goes over the attributes of the space, so it can range from the basics, like you're just protecting people from inclement weather, to the best practice approach, which would provide individuals access to bedrooms and bathrooms that are private. Programming considerations include a good approach such as the basic needs being met, all the way to a best practice approach where you are providing housing-focused case management and providing clients with assistance for housing search and placement. And then this document also goes through COVID-19 considerations. So the infection control measures that you can put in place at the very basic level, maintaining social distancing, making sure everyone wears face masks, providing referrals to testing, ranging all the way to a best practice model such as implementing symptom screening, making sure that people experiencing homelessness are prioritized for non-congregate sheltering or isolation quarantine, and you're basing that on high-risk factors, which would make them more at higher risk for getting sick and having negative health outcomes. And then this document also goes through funding considerations, which we will also go over in the next slide.
Ok, este es un documento que habla básicamente de los componentes de los varios espacios que se pueden usar para el refugio. Aquí se ve como 3 niveles. Good approach, satisfactorio, better, bien, un poquito mejor, y best practice, como las mejores prácticas. Básicamente, este documento habla pues del espacio, el tipo de espacio, cuáles son los componentes del espacio, cuáles son las consideraciones programáticas, es decir, que cuáles son las personas admitidas, debajo de qué condición, consideraciones de COVID, básicamente para mantener la salud pública y prevenir la propagación del virus. Y el último es de funding, de financiamiento y cómo se puede pagar para estos sitios.
So the funding that's eligible under the ESG emergency shelter component can be used to pay for acquisition of real property up to $2.5 million per real property under temporary emergency shelter. You can also pay services, including essential services, that's under the emergency shelter component. You could also pay for housing search and placement services, which is usually under the rapid rehousing or homelessness prevention component. And housing search and counseling services under the COC program are also eligible under temporary emergency shelter. The other shelter costs, oh, I think someone just needs to mute themselves. The other shelter costs that HUD approves in writing are also eligible. So if there's something that you can think of that's not specifically identified in the notice, you can contact HUD through your, you can contact your field office, and we can consider approving those additional shelter costs. But you can refer to Section 3E3A of the notice to make sure that you're meeting all the requirements for temporary emergency shelter.
Ok, aquí están hablando de cuáles son los varios gastos, servicios que se pueden pagar con estos fondos debajo del componente de Emergency Shelter. También se puede adquirir propiedad de bienes raíces, ¿verdad? Hasta 2.5 millones por cada uno. También entregar servicios adicionales. Hay una lista aquí de servicios esenciales, de búsqueda de vivienda y ubicación, y también de counseling, capacitación de servicios. Si hay otros costos relacionados con los refugios y albergues, se puede peticionar a HUD para usar fondos para estas alternativas, pero tiene que tener la aprobación de HUD en forma escrita. Thank you.
We outlined the basic requirements that apply to temporary emergency shelter, and as well as the waivers. So one alternative requirement is that the minimum period of use that usually applies to emergency shelter renovation projects does not apply. However, the disposition requirements in Part 200 do apply. The environmental review requirements do not apply as well, but just remember that the local public health department does have to determine and document that temporary emergency shelter is necessary for COVID response. The shelter habitability standards do not apply to temporary emergency shelter. Lead-based paint requirements still do apply, and all non-discrimination and accessibility requirements still do apply. And we just included a note there that it's important to remember structures such as trailers and other non-conventional shelter structures must meet ADA requirements in order to be eligible.
Ok, aquí son una lista corta de cuáles son los elementos que aplica y no aplica, es decir, de donde hay un waiver, una renuncia. Primero es que no aplica un periodo de uso mínimo, es decir, que si se necesita usar un albergue o un refugio para un periodo corto, se puede usarlo. El segundo son el Environmental Review, indicando que estos requisitos no son aplicables, pero sí tiene que tener un oficial de salud pública determinar que este refugio es necesario. El tercero habla de las normas, ¿verdad?, de habitabilidad, que no aplica en este caso. Sí aplica los requisitos de lead paint, todavía aplica. Y el último es que esos requisitos de no discriminar y tener accesibilidad sí aplica, notando abajo en rojo que si tienen estructuras que no son convencionales, que todavía tiene que tener el acceso para las personas que son discapacitadas. Thank you.
The next eligible activity that we're going to talk about is landlord incentives. You can use these costs as reasonable and necessary to incentivize landlords for providing housing to ESG-CV funded program participants. The types of incentives that can be provided include signing bonuses equal to up to 2 months of rent, a security deposit equal up to 3 months of rent, paying the cost to repair damages incurred by the program participant that's not covered by the security deposit that was provided or that's incurred while the program participant is residing in the unit. And you could also use incentives to pay for the costs of extra cleaning or maintenance of a program participant's unit or appliances. Recipients can't use ESG-CV funds to pay the landlord in an amount that exceeds 3 times the rent charged for the unit. So you would take the rent, multiply it by 3, and that's the maximum amount for landlord incentives. We are providing more guidance on tools that can help navigate using resources together with other funding sources, so just stay tuned for that. If you have any questions about how to calculate landlord incentives, or if you're interested in doing something but you're just not entirely sure if it's eligible, then please submit an AAQ and we can provide you with more assistance.
Okay, I'm aware of the time that we have, and so in the translation now, I'm going to sort of give a little bit of a higher level summary rather than going line by line.
Sure.
Yo voy a resumir un poquito por razones del tiempo. Aquí están hablando de los incentivos para dueños de vivienda que son razonables y necesarios. Básicamente se puede pagar un nivel más que la renta normal hasta 3 veces. También se puede dar unos incentivos como un bono para admitir a la persona, un depósito de seguridad. Son varios extras que se puede incluir en pagos a un dueño de vivienda para que él participe en el programa.
Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Nora now to go over the waivers and alternative requirements.
Thank you, Marlisa. My computer froze. Could you can you do the first ones and then I'll jump in if you do this?
Oh, sure. Yep.
I should be back up. Thanks.
Okay. So the first flexibility that the first set of flexibilities includes the match requirement. The match requirement is waived. So if you are spending your ESG-CV funds on if you're paying it applies across the board to ESG-CV funds. If you're using your annual ESG funds for COVID response, match is not required for those funds as well. The other flexibilities include an income limit increase from 30% to the very low income limit of the area under the at-risk of homelessness definition. The street outreach emergency shelter cap is waived, as well as the admin cap is increased. It's not waived, it's increased from 7.5% to 10%, and the fair market rent limit is also waived. That means you have to meet rent reasonableness, but the fair market rent limit is not applicable. And these, again, are applicable to all ESG-CV funds as well as annual funds used for COVID response.
Pues esas son flexibilidades de renuncia, básicamente que el pareo está waived, está renunciado. La definición de quién puede participar en el programa ha cambiado a 30, to the very low income limit de ese cierto área. El límite en albergue outreach está renunciado. El administrative cap ha cambiado y se puede usar hasta 10% de los fondos de ESG-CV para gastos administrativos, y también está una renuncia para el fair market rent limit.
I can jump in, Marlisa.
Okay, great. Yep.
Sure. There are some more flexibilities. We'll just hit some of the highlights, and some of them Marlisa already talked about in the conversation about temporary emergency shelter. So one that I'll highlight on this slide relates to other kinds of hotel and motel costs. So ESG-CV funds can be used to pay for hotel and motel costs for individuals and families who are experiencing homelessness, those who are receiving rapid rehousing assistance under either the Continuum of Care or ESG program, those who are receiving homelessness prevention assistance under the ESG program, or are residing in permanent supportive housing.
Ok, básicamente aquí son más renuncias hablando específicamente de cómo se puede usar fondos para gastos de hotel y motel para personas sin vivienda, personas recibiendo asistencia debajo de RAPID, tercero de personas recibiendo fondos de prevención debajo de ESG, o personas que están viviendo en vivienda asistida de supported housing.
And the next slide provides just a little bit more information about what those costs for hotel and motel can be. It can be for the cost of renting hotel or motel rooms directly or through a hotel or motel voucher. It can be for the cost of cleaning hotel or motel rooms used by program participants. And it can be used for repair for damages caused by program participants above normal wear and tear. Just a reminder that these costs as emergency solutions grant costs have to be under the emergency shelter component.
Básicamente uno de esos gastos que son elegibles cuando uno está usando como refugio de emergencia un hotel o motel.
And here is yet more information about how to use those costs. So I think we can leave this as a reference slide that people can look back at if they want more information on this.
Sí, aquí son un poquito más información y detalles.
Additional flexibilities include some of the more process-related items in the ESG program. There are some flexibilities related to the homeless management information system, the requirements to consult with the Continuum of Care, and also some coordination with mainstream resources. And that it's important to know that there is some flexibility in the funds for participants who've received the max amount of assistance, which is 24 months in 3 years during the period between January 21st, 2020 and March 1st, 2021. These participants may receive an additional 6 months of rental assistance and services.
Son más flexibles aquí, pero yo pienso que el más importante es el último, que es decir que personas que están dentro del programa que ya han recibido un nivel de asistencia máxima ya, 24 meses dentro de 3 años, son elegibles para recibir 6 meses adicionales de asistencia y servicio. Thank you.
There are some additional flexibilities for procurement for the recipient. They may deviate from the procurement standards when they're procuring goods to prevent, prepare for, or respond to coronavirus. And there are also some flexibilities related to program income, which are defined in the slide here.
Flexibilidad con la conseguir servicios, tratar de administrar una norma alternativa, pero tienes que documentarlo, y también hay unas renuncias relacionadas con program income.
And we've talked about the flexibilities included in the notice. There are also some limitations to the ESG-CV activities, and these limitations apply to a recipient that had its substantial amendment or action plan to HUD, and HUD completed its review on or after September 1st, 2020. In recipients that fall into that situation have to adhere to the limitation that medium-term rental assistance is limited to 3 to 12 months instead of 3 to 24 months. And emergency shelter activities, including temporary emergency shelter, may be provided only until January 31st, 2022.
Ok, puntos importantes de limitaciones que son asistencia de alquiler está limitado a 3 a 12 meses. Y el otro es que todas estas actividades de emergency shelter, refugio de emergencia, se pueden usar solamente hasta enero 31 de 2022.
And HUD recognizes that coronavirus response is complex and might require additional flexibilities. So in order to request those flexibilities, recipients may submit waiver requests for things like requesting to extend that January 31st, 2022 limit for temporary emergency shelter, or to expend funds on temporary emergency shelter costs not identified in the ESG-CV notice. And waiver requests are submitted to the HUD field office with the description of the project, the regulatory citation, and an explanation of the need for the waiver and how the waiver is necessary to prepare for or respond to coronavirus.
Sí, HUD reconoce que esta es una situación complicada y quieren dar la oportunidad para más flexibilidad y tienen la oportunidad de peticionar a HUD si quieres una anuncia de otro elemento, otro componente del programa.
Okay, Marilisa, back to you.
Okay, so we're going to highlight a few items about ESG-CV reporting, but you should consult a series of webinars that go into a lot of detail about the step-by-step process and how to report. So the reporting requirement is quarterly. The first report was due September 30th, and the next reporting period ends on December 31st. The guidebooks include information about exactly what you're going to need to report on, as well as when reporting kicks in. So if you haven't signed a grant agreement yet, then the reporting won't be required until the next quarterly reporting period. But our overall priority is to minimize extra reporting burdens. So we've set up reporting in the following ways: quarterly reports submitted through SAGE, which is going to be collecting HMIS data and expenditure information. And just so you know, the annual CAPER is also required, but we have provided a waiver that grants an additional 180 days from the end of the program year for that report to be submitted.
Están hablando de los informes que son necesarios a nivel de trimestral, ¿verdad? Que va a usar información del HMIS y también de información de los gastos. Y se requiere también un informe anual del CAPERS después de 180 días de cuando termina el año programado.
And this slide goes over the general flow of data and the different roles that each entity has. For recipients, the recipient is responsible for entering data into the reporting system, and the subs, as well as the sub-subs, who are the direct providers of the assistance, they're going to be the ones who enter data into HMIS, or if they're a victim service provider, a comparable database. The HMIS lead, or victim service provider, is responsible for generating the reports and uploading them into SAGE, And then once the recipient receives the data reports in SAGE, the recipient's responsible for reviewing the information and submitting the ESG-CV report to HUD each quarter.
Eso básicamente son el proceso de cómo recordar información del programa y cómo entregarlo a HUD a través de HMIS y también el base de datos de SAGE. Marlis, I see
and before,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead, sorry.
Just a very quick question that I noticed in the chat. Is this information put in separately from the regular ESG data entry?
So the data entry in HMIS is separate for ESG-CV. It's separate projects need to be set up. But we can also provide a link to the program manual that goes into detail about how to set up projects for ESG-CV.
Ok, sí son separados y también se va a entregar un lazo al manual de programa que da más información de este proceso. Okay.
And before we transition over to the Q&A session, we just want to go over some important highlights as far as overall grants management. Please make sure that your ESG program has enough admin capacity and staffing. So you have the additional admin funds that are available to provided for ESG-CV to ramp up. Please make use of that and make sure that you have enough staff. Staffing increases are going to help you ensure that you're effectively managing your grant, especially in circumstances where states are hoping to, if you're hoping to expand your pool of subs to include those who don't have prior experience with ESG. And then also realize that overhead costs associated with increasing admin staff are also eligible. And if you have overhead costs that are related to your activities, like if you need extra laptops, cell phones for case management, anything like that for staff carrying out the ESG program, you can charge that to the actual component. That doesn't need to be admin, but any sort of activity delivery cost can be charged to the component. So these are tips just meant to help you make sure that you've got enough people to carry out your program effectively.
Es recordatorio de bien importante tener la capacidad administrativa para manejar el programa, especialmente si hay unos subresidentes que son nuevos al programa de ESG. Y el último punto es que si tienen unos costos adicionales que no son de salario, que por ejemplo computadora, teléfono, que se puede usar fondos específicamente de los program activities, ¿verdad? De albergue, de outreach, de rapid, de prevención, y cobrar esos gastos dentro de esos programas, es decir, que no son gastos administrativos.
All right, now I'm going to turn it over to Mandy and Taylor to go over some of your questions, and we'll get to as many as we can before we end at 10 o'clock. Mandy, Taylor?
Hi, good morning, everyone. Marlisa, can you hear me?
I can.
Yeah.
Great. So I'll jump in with a few. We had a question about providing assistance through hotel and motel stays. And the question is there a time limit for how long you could pay for someone to stay in a hotel or motel?
There is not a time limit, but we stress that if you are putting people up in a hotel or motel, that you absolutely have a rehousing strategy along with your non-congregate sheltering strategy. So making sure that that you're pairing hotel and motel costs with a rapid exit to permanent housing, and also just to be aware of reasonable and appropriate requirements.
Ok, fue una pregunta de cuánto tiempo una persona puede quedarse en un hotel pagado por el programa, y Mauricio dice que no hay un límite, pero tomando en cuenta de que esos gastos tienen que ser razonables y necesarios, pero también hay que tener un plan de largo plazo para poner a esa persona en una vivienda permanente. Okay.
Thank you. Another question we received asks, what happens to temporary emergency shelter once the pandemic is over? So Marlisa, could you talk a little bit about the transition requirements for the temporary shelters?
Yes. If you use ESG-CV or annual ESG-CV for coronavirus response for acquisition or renovation of a temporary emergency shelter, once the original use is no longer required, so once you no longer use that structure for temporary emergency shelter for COVID response, Part 200 applies. It's 200.311. That requires compensation to HUD, and we're going to provide more information, more guidance about that, but it's a really important consideration if you are thinking about using ESG funds for acquisition or renovation, that the funds do need to be compensated to HUD once the original use of the temporary emergency shelter concludes.
Sí, es un tema un poco complicado, pero la pregunta fue ¿qué pasa con estos refugios temporarios después de ese periodo de COVID? Y hay una fórmula que Mauricio va a poner disponible de cómo se puede compensar a HUD para el uso después del periodo de COVID. Okay.
Thank you. Marlisa, there was a question here that was asking about temporary shelters and if they're similar to what is established after a natural disaster, or what the Salvation Army might use. So it might be helpful. Could you just provide some examples that come to mind of what a temporary emergency shelter might include?
Sure. And the alternative sheltering document that we mentioned earlier is also a really good reference. We provide examples there too. But an example, it would be a strung structure, like a military style tent, where everything, we've got a cover on all sides and on the top. Another thing could be converting public spaces, like a gymnasium or something, like using partitions and minimizing social, maximizing social distancing. That's another example of what you could do for a temporary emergency shelter. You could even repurpose. Like a public transportation. So if you were to take a bus and be able to restructure it to be able to provide a few spaces for people, including sleeping areas that are partitioned out, you could do something like that. So those are some examples of what you could do for a temporary emergency shelter.
Con varios ejemplos de refugios de emergencia, como tener una carpa de estilo militar para dar protección con el tiempo, usar una facilidad como un gimnasio, o también se puede usar hasta una guagua si hay la habilidad de poner espacio suficiente dentro del vehículo para que las personas puedan mantener su distancia social. Okay.
Would the equipment inside such temporary shelter be covered?
Yes, you would have to have cover on all sides, and you would just need to make sure that there's adequate space to maintain social distancing, and also adequate space so that people have a place to rest, to sleep, so it would have to be equipped with like cots or mats or something to that effect.
Right, and that cost of that equipment as far is going to be covered, correct?
Oh, yes.
That's what
yes,
I was saying.
That's right.
Okay. Okay.
Yep. If it's an ordinarily eligible ESG operating cost, you can use that for temporary emergency shelter as well.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. And I know that there are so many more questions, but I'm going to turn it over to Wilfredo to close out the call.
Okay, thank you so much, Marlisa. I really want to thank you all, Marlisa, Darlene, Nora, Matt, everyone, for this excellent opportunity. It's been very helpful for us. So, para nuestros grantees, de verdad que ha sido una oportunidad única tener a este equipo de trabajo, a este personal que son en realidad los más que saben de este programa y que hayan dedicado su tiempo para nosotros en Puerto Rico y las Islas Vírgenes, pues en verdad es un honor. So it was an honor to have you all, really. Thank you. So I think we should give you a round of applause, right? That's a wrap. Thank you.
Muchas gracias a todos.
Thank you. Bye.